All right, this is going to be a kind of a video request from one of my subscribers and herself, a fairly avid YouTuber, Poe the Person. She made a video last week or 2 weeks ago called "The Slow Death of Liberty in the UK," and I left a comment on there, and she asked rather, if I might elaborate on some of the ideas I expressed in that. So, if you've been a long time subscriber to my channel, you may know that some of the first YouTube series that I did was kind of under the moniker the Libertarian Spark, and it was my attempt to try and explain why different societies value libertarianism either explicitly or implicitly to different degrees, and especially why the United States values liberty to the extent that it does, and especially in contrast to its most similar other societies in Europe, basically, or Canada, um, or say Australia. So, you know, I don't think that there is a simple answer to any of those questions. I think that those are almost all highly multifaceted questions that rely a lot on history and accidents of coincidence and circumstances and practical considerations as well as philosophical ones. I remember one of the books that I reviewed in that is a juxtaposition of the United States and Canada called Deference to Authority, The Case for Canada, which is a pretty good book. I don't know of any that directly compare the U.S. and the U.K., but having known a lot of people in the U.K. and having traveled to the U.K. And noticed many of the differences, uh, I think that this is a really interesting topic and one that's worth looking at. As somebody who values liberty both for its deontological benefits and for its utilitarian benefits, which from the best that I can tell are basically unified, right? I'm not one of those people who thinks that if we enact libertarianism, even very radical libertarianism, that there'll be a high utilitarian cost, but we should do it anyway, or that uh, or that I think that enacting even very radical libertarianism would be beneficial as far as we're able to measure such a thing at a societal level as well as a personal level. Um, Nor am I the type of person who would say that I don't care about ethics or morality. I'm nihilistic when it comes to that. I don't feel that way about morality or ethics, and I think that there's a good in itself in terms of the quality of the libertarian ethics or the libertarian critique of conventional ethics that we have today. So basically, in my comment to Poe, which I'm not going to read here, but you're welcome to go to her channel and look at the video and see what I wrote, is that uh, being to be a virtuous person, to be somebody who can value liberty and can exercise it, you need to practice it. It's something that you need to do. And this is an idea that I'm borrowing very heavily from Aristotle. So I'm going to read very quickly here. So if you ever read the Nicomachean Ethic by Aristotle, I'm going to quote a little bit of that, but I'm just going to read. If you just go to the Wikipedia page on Aristotle's Ethics, and you scroll down to the part that says practical ethics, um, Aristotle believed that ethical knowledge is not only a theoretical knowledge, but rather that a person must have experience of the action in life and have been brought up in the fields of habits to become good. That's from Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5. For a person to become virtuous, he can't simply study what virtue is, but must actually do virtuous things. And then a quote, uh, we are not studying in order to know what virtue is, but to become good, for otherwise it would be no profit in it. So this is an idea. Aristotle is not a perfect libertarian, and his worldview is not a perfect libertarian one. He is very much writing in the context of the political units of the Greek polis. But the idea is that virtuous citizens need to be able to exercise that virtue. They need to have a choice in a fairly wide scope of matters. And if they are denied that, if they can't make decisions for themselves on whether to act right or wrong, then they are not going to be virtuous. They are not going to be quote unquote good citizens. Uh, and this is kind of a real problem for systems of welfare states or extensive political states because they're kind of predicated on the electorate doing a good job and regulating the government and making good ballot decisions, but the role of the state in those societies erodes the people's ability to even do that, right? You have the extent and the scope as it grows of government influence erodes the personal virtue of members in that society. And there's a couple examples between the US and the UK where this is pretty clear. So the one that is no surprise and one of the biggest differences, and I don't think this is an accident, is the role of not only gun ownership and gun availability, but self-defense between the two countries. Self-defense is not, strictly speaking, completely illegal in the UK, but it is heavily regulated, heavily discouraged, and practically illegal most of the time. Sometimes there might be situations where there's prosecutors might be lenient in certain cases, but it's strictly speaking not encouraged. It's definitely not allowed. Where in the U.S., at least in most of the U.S., definitely is allowed. Well, the mindset of a person in those two societies is completely different. In the United States, even if you don't own a gun, even if you've never had to defend yourself, you are aware that that's something that you can do, that it's your right, and you act accordingly. And that was something that I philosophically believed. I did not grow up in a house that owned guns. My father was a bow hunter, so I grew up doing bows and arrows, but I never touched a gun until I was in my mid 20s, basically, like 23, 24, something like that. And I was philosophically for gun rights. But I will tell you that the day that I bought my first gun, this baby right here, this is a Benelli M4 Marine Tactical Semi-Automatic Shotgun. It's definitely not legal in the UK, and it's perfectly legal and unregulated in the US. I bought this at a store, no questions asked. Walked in, gave them the money, they gave me the gun. This is a 12-gauge shotgun. This is the shotgun of the U.S. Marine Corps. So this could be easily considered a military weapon, even though most military weapons are going to be rifles and not shotguns, but this is the Marine shotgun. And I will say that the day that I bought this and brought it home and opened it up and did require a little bit of assembly, but not any more than a person who never touched a gun was able to handle. And the second that I held it in my hands, it gave me a totally different, not a totally different, but a different perspective, an appreciation for the power that I was wielding. This was something that I knew was consistently absolutely lethal. This is something that I could use to kill innocent people or to kill evil people. I could use it to defend myself or to defend others, or I could commit a horrible, deadly crime with it. And that was a deep responsibility. And that changed the way I looked at guns, I looked at myself, and I looked at other people. It wasn't like a complete change. It was just a subtle revolution in perspective. That all the years of being pro-gun, and I had been pro-gun for probably close to a decade at that point, and arguing for the Second Amendment and gun rights and all this stuff. And one of the reasons I bought a gun is because I felt like I was a bit of a hypocrite for having those stances and not exercising, what I considered to be my rights. But that act made me a more responsible person, just in thinking. And now, I've got, if you look, I've got a gun safe full of guns, and and there's even more levels to this. I could start open carrying or concealed carrying my handgun for personal protection. I don't do it because I don't feel endangered ever. I live in a state where the homicide rate is lower than it is in the UK. Even when I lived in states where it was a lot higher, it still wasn't high enough for me to actually kind of worry about it. But that mentality of I'm responsible for myself, I'm potentially in a position to help others, and also I could become something of a petty tyrant or a terrible criminal. That really changes your perspective. And that is something that people in the UK are just not going to feel. You certainly can't do it. You certainly can't own a gun like this, period, or a handgun for that matter. You aren't free to conceal carry it or open carry it wherever you'd like or when you go about your daily life. You are not going to be encouraged to use it for self-defense. And in the United States, even people who are strongly for stronger gun regulations, even David Hogg or the Parkland shooters who, not the shooters, but the children from Parkland who have become outspoken banner holders for the cause of gun control, even they would not deny that you have the right to defend your life with a weapon, lethally. And that's a position that I know in the UK is not widely held. That's something that people are not going to agree with. And so I think in the United States, we don't know how many people carry a gun for protection. We know that there are 16 million people who have licenses to carry guns for personal protection. And we know that most of those people do carry regularly. However, there's something like, at this point, I think 11, 12, maybe 13, 14 states that you do not require you to even have a permit to do that. So we have no idea how many people in those states are doing it. It could be more, it could be less. There's also the little quirk where you can open carry a firearm in a lot of states, including states that heavily restrict concealed carry, sometimes don't restrict open carry. I know the state that I'm originally from, you needed a license to concealed carry, but you did not need a license to open carry. Interesting kind of distinction and quirk in the law. And we just don't know how many people do or don't do that. But then we have all the people who maybe they don't conceal carry in their daily lives, but it's 40 to 50% of the households have a gun in them. So the members of those households have that gun. Most of them in surveys say that they have it for self-defense. So even if they're not carrying it with them, they have it with that idea. And that changes your perspective. You become responsible for yourself in a way that you weren't previously. You look to yourself in a way that you didn't previously. Now, compare this to a society that heavily restricts gun ownership. Maybe you can keep a shotgun at the range, but you have to keep it locked up. Ammunition has to be separate. You need to get a lot of licenses. Your license can be revoked whenever the police say that you can be denied a license for any reason, blah, 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 which is what we were looking at when you're looking at a country like the UK. You have no scope to exercise. Your life is literally not in your hands. You are supposed to call the police and leave it to them. And so what is the point of having liberty in that situation? You are just at the behest and at the mercy of the government. And you're taught that from an early age, and that's your expectation your whole life. And the thing is, like virtues, as Aristotle mentions, and I don't think he's the only one who has this insight, it's something that you have to learn. And it's just like growing up. I mean, if you take a person, and as they grow up, their parents keep them in the home, don't let them get a job, don't let them work, don't let them live on their own, don't let them develop their own personal autonomy at all, but they take care of them, they feed them and take them on family vacations and give them maybe a little bit of an allowance. That person's just not going to be very responsible. They might be highly intelligent, they might read a lot, they could definitely read a Murray Rothbard book, they could definitely go to university and get a degree in philosophy or something, but they don't exercise their autonomy at all, or to a much more retarded extent. And that's going to change the way they look at the world. And that's going to change, what's the point of liberty to them? They don't have liberty. They are being taken care of by their parents. And that holds true is if you have a state. And, I've mentioned gun control because it's an obvious one, and I'm going to set my Benelli here on the bed for a minute. But I can think of other examples. The other very clear one would be healthcare. Now, we can have a very detailed discussion about the pros and cons of free market healthcare versus single payer universal healthcare, and we could obviously have an even more interesting discussion about what's in the United States and the problems with what we have in the United States, of which I've done videos, and we all know that there are many problems in the United States, and what you have in the UK, and there are many problems with the NHS, despite the patriotic, uncritical laurels that are, that's their new nationalism, is to praise the NHS for God knows why. We could have a discussion about that, and we might even conclude, well, in terms of cost benefit analysis, maybe that system is better than the U.S. system, at least as it currently is. But there's an element to the analysis I think that you miss when you do that, because it's actually important if you are responsible for your own healthcare. There's a whole question of moral hazard. If I know that at the end of the day, I'm responsible for my healthcare. If I get into a car accident and I have to pay for any of the medical bills, I'm going to drive safer. I'm going to wear my seatbelt. I'm going to maybe decide if the weather's bad, or if it's foggy or rainy, I'm not going to go somewhere, or I'm going to drive much slower, or I'm going to have a car that's safer, right? Or I'm going to live healthier. I'm going to make sure I go to the gym. I'm going to make sure that I'm active and that I eat well. Because at the end of the day, if I have a heart attack or if I get obese or if I have any of the related health issues, diabetes, whatever, I'm the one who's going to have to pay for that. Or I'm going to have to beg for charity from somebody else and it's going to be on their terms. Versus my healthcare is just a universal system, however it's conveyed in the UK. And it's not something that I have to think about in that sense. Now, I might stress about it. I might worry, are they going to get around to giving me cancer treatment? Just like I might worry if I call the police and hope that they get to me when they need me. And I have a good friend in the UK, another YouTuber, who told me he's a small business owner, and he had a dispute with some subcontractors who were gypsies, who are not known for being pacifists or Quakers or anything like that. And they actively threatened him over this dispute and actually came to his house banging on the door demanding that that he pay them basically. And he was married, he had two small children, and he was terrified. And he had no option but to call the police. And he called the police before this happened because they had basically threatened him. And they said, we're not going to do anything until it happens. Until they actually come by, there's nothing we can or will do. So he was completely helpless. He was completely at the whim of the state. And that's the state that he's always in. Now, he doesn't always have an emergency going on, but it's the same thing as if he had got cancer or if he had diabetes or he had an elderly parent who was in some kind of assisted living or required lots of medical attention, and it's totally up to the state to decide. Well, that changes your entire perspective. You no longer have any kind of incentive to exercise your moral judgment. None. And so healthcare is another big one. And there's other ones. Obviously free speech is not as robust in the UK as it is in the US. And so what are you going to say? And I've noticed when I go to the UK, people get very uncomfortable if I speak too politically incorrectly. There's a real fear of, hey, you shouldn't say those things because you could be punished. And that self-censorship, in a lot of ways, in fact, I would say, is definitely a lot worse than the actual, like the chances that the government's going to know what you said and come after you, they're pretty limited. But the fact that you're like, oh, I'm not supposed to get out of line and say stuff that may upset people or offend people, that is really pernicious. Another thing I think a lot of people wouldn't really necessarily realize is just the proliferation of mass transit. When I get in my car, getting in my car is in a lot of ways worse than having a gun. Yes, that shotgun is deadly and effective. It's an effective killing machine. But like in terms of kinetic energy, when I get in my truck and get on the highway, I have vastly more destructive potential, and the fatalities in the United States reflect that. Right, we have way more people who are dying from vehicular accidents than are being killed by guns, even if you include people who are intentionally, suicides, homicides, and accidental gun deaths. And so, when I get behind the wheel of my car, I'm responsible for that. And I'm not just responsible for myself. I'm responsible for any passengers. I'm responsible for anyone on the road that I may or may not hit. And that's both humbling and empowering. And I noticed whenever I've gone to, say, a big city in the U.S. like New York or D.C., or when I went to the UK and I spent basically most of my time in London, I spent a lot of time riding the tube. And like, it's not on you. You go and you stand in this big aluminum tube full of strangers, or maybe your company, and nobody talks to each other. They all ignore each other, which is also strange. And then it's not up to you. It's automated, or there's a conductor or a train driver. And this isn't just the tube; it's the buses, it's the trains. Obviously, there are people who own cars and drive cars in the UK, but it's a way lower margin than what you have in the United States. And you're in that situation. You're just completely not responsible. You are just going on for the ride. You don't decide where you stop. You don't decide when you start. You don't decide. You can't just say, I want to get off here, get off there. You get off when they tell you. And you're just completely not responsible. And so what is liberty? What does it mean to have liberty in the context of riding the tube. You have a restriction of options, and that's all you ever get. So that's all you're ever going to think about. And we have this, problem in the U.S. too, where we have a lot of people, especially in urban centers. Yeah, that they don't own cars, they don't own guns. They ride the subway everywhere. They take the bus everywhere, and they live a life where they are deferring to the government to make decisions for them more and more. And if you go to more rural areas, and this is probably also true in the UK, the state is just not as expansive. Its scope isn't as great, and so you have a uh, greater greater canvas on which to exercise your own decision and your own autonomy. And the result is that people who live in that situation are going to be more libertarian, at least in practice. And while there's certainly differences within the UK, as there are differences within the US, there are definitely net differences between the UK and the US. The average American and the average person in the UK do not have similar scopes for their expression of autonomy. And without that expression, you really can't be. You're not. There's no point in valuing liberty, right? And people will kind of. I think one of the counters people will have to this is like, well, maybe it's true that the government's deciding X, Y, A, B, C, D, all these things, but in a democracy, as a voter, as part of the electorate, you do get to exercise your autonomy through the ballot box. And I think that that's complete bullshit. Yes, it's true, you do get to vote, but the insulation between your decision making and what actually happens is so great that it's essentially protecting the system from you and you from the system from having any responsibility. You voting for a different person to be a representative in Parliament, let's say, or Congress, and then them voting on what's going to be done about the healthcare is not equivalent to you deciding for yourself where am I going to get insurance? Am I going to get it through my job? Am I going to purchase insurance? Do I even want insurance at all? Am I going to do X? Am I going to do Y? Am I going to join a gym? Right? Like, those are not comparable situations. Or this is even allowing that the system's not completely corrupt, or that that the politicians are not cynical or beholden to special interests. This is just assuming that elections are a conduit of your will to policy, which is, I think, largely false. It's maybe not binary to say you have no influence, but your influence is minuscule to the point of approaching infinitesimal. Even in a relatively small, even if we're talking about 1 million people voting, the amount of influence you have, especially in a non-direct democracy, is vanishingly small, versus the effect that your decisions have on yourself, right? If you carry a gun, if you buy a gun, even if you never use a gun, the money that you spent on it, that really affects you. The fact that you store it, the fact that you keep it, the fact that you use it recreationally or to train, that has a much bigger effect on you than did you vote for there to be a politician who will then decide if maybe they will expropriate more money to pay for more police officers or not, right? And and that's if I've never even used the gun in self-defense. And if I use the gun in self-defense, which is done something on the order of 1 million, 2 million times a year in the United States, usually non-lethally, all right, people brandish the weapon and chase someone away. That's very real, right? So there is no, oh, well, the authority is being exercised by the state, but you influence the state, so you're still exercising decision making. No, it's not. There's no equivalency there. That's a false equivalence. It might be true that a person in the government, say the president or a senator, that they do have that level of control, and so like a powerful MP, or maybe just a congressman or a governor, that their control over the state is sufficient that is a surrogate that could count. But your role as simply a member of a ballot creator, somebody who's going to cast a single vote, that is not connecting. That's not action connected to your decision-making process. And then there's a whole problem there. Not to rehash it, but there's a lot of rational ignorance there. There's little incentive to even know what you're doing, because there's such a huge disconnect between what you decide and how you vote and what actually happens, which is, I mean, it's possible that when you make a decision for yourself, that there could still be some kind of short circuit between what you decide and your actions and the results. Sure, but it's much, 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 much more direct, orders of magnitude more direct, and the effect on your psyche and on your thought process and on your virtue is going to be completely different. And some of the virtues, like prudence, like courage, like love, temperance, all these are actually virtues that the state kind of actively erodes, right? It actively erodes the idea of being personally courageous. It actually actively erodes the idea of being prudent. Correct? Because it's all, what do I got to do to win the next election? What do I do what do I have to do to beat my enemies right now? What do I have to say to win? What do I have, deceitful demagoguery, misleading, omission, commission, deceit. Those are all the things that win. Those are all the things that get you ahead in politics. Those are not necessarily the things that get you ahead in life. They certainly don't make you virtuous. And this is kind of, this debate is sometimes framed when people talk about like the Second Amendment and defense against tyranny, because people will say stuff like, people need to be armed to defend themselves against the government, and then people will say, well, the government, what if the government is, we should assume the government's going to be good. But if the government is going around trying to become a monopoly in force and trying to eliminate all potential rivals and trying to accumulate as much relative power in its hands to everybody else, then it's kind of a ridiculous assumption to assume that it's going to have your best interests at heart, or that it's not going to be tyrannical. A lot of the stuff about democracy kind of assumes, well, this will work if the electorate has certain virtues and is paying attention. A lot of things people say, well, government corruption shouldn't be a problem because the people who are the voters will vote out people who are corrupt or vote out people who make bad decisions. And aside from all the institutional problems that restrict, if someone makes a bad decision, you can't vote them out right then. There's a whole problem with them creating a basket of issues. So yes, maybe Hillary Clinton did X, Y, and Z that is terrible, but Donald Trump also did W, Y, and Z that are all terrible, or she has good policies A, B, and C, and so you have to make this thing, and you end up basically having kind of no ability to, or I don't want to say none, but practically no ability to exercise that kind of control. The amount of control that you exercise individually is again, approaches zero. And then you have just no incentive to care or to really put any thought into it. And we know statistically that's true, right? Surveys of voters show they don't know anything. They're largely apathetic, and why shouldn't they be? They don't have a lot of control over that. So they don't really exercise autonomy vis-a-vis the state. But then if the scope of what the state does is quite limited, they're going to be taking care of themselves. They're going to be planning for their own retirement. Right? So everyone thinks Social Security is such obviously a good thing, right? Oh, I don't have to plan ahead because there is a Social Security program that will take care of me. I don't have to worry about working hard and making sound financial decisions because there's a welfare state. There's a safety net, and the government will take care of me if I fuck up, even if I fuck up all the time, right? So that's not going to make people fuck up less. There's no part, and we can make an argument for a welfare state. Sure, as far as states go, it's not the worst possible thing, but you can't make the claim that making that available is going to make people less likely to take involved. If you're going to subsidize it, you're going to get more. If you're going to say being unemployed or being a single mom or having children out of wedlock or being poor or not working or being unable to work is something that you can get money for, more people are going to do it. Now, certainly there are people who would be in that situation anyway, right? I'm not saying that every single person who has a child out of wedlock only did it because of the state subsidy, because there's plenty of people who would still do it even if that subsidy wasn't there, or that there aren't people who genuinely cannot work because something actually happened to them. It's not a choice that they made. But there's plenty of people who make the decision to do it because the subsidy is there. There's marginal people, and if we're talking about a country as big as the United States, the marginal people number in the millions who are making the choice to do that. And that's not going to make the electorate better. That's not going to make people vote virtuous things. It's not going to make people care about liberty. They don't. What do they care? They are getting they're getting paternalism. They're surrendering their autonomy to the state. And if you do that, what's the point of having autonomy? What does that even matter? It doesn't mean anything, and it's one thing if the state controls the post office, that's pretty shitty. If the state controls defense, that's pretty shitty. But then you have another state that also controls healthcare and also controls education and also controls welfare and also controls your speech and also controls self-defense and also, well, that's that much worse. And there's a lot of ways in which the U.S. state is worse than the state in the U.K., especially if we're talking about foreign policy, right? The U.S. state is projecting this power all over the world in a way that the UK state simply can't. It has in the past, but it can't today to that same level. It still does it enough that it's criminal and terrible and genocidal and deserves to be condemned, but it's not the same level. But internally, the UK state, I think, and people can debate this if they want, seems to have a much greater scope and power relative to its populace than the American state does with its. And that is reflected in the character of the two countries and of the two people. Now, interesting question, why is there a difference? And again, I don't think that there's a single answer here. The United States, I think we have to acknowledge, is a self-selected populace, right? It was immigrants who came here, and the people who came here, people who decided to leave England or Germany or France or all those other countries, it was not a random selection of people. It was selecting for certain traits, whether they be cultural or genetic, and in all likelihood both, deciding to move here. And when you have a situation where, say, the 10% of people in the UK who are the least deferential to authority all move in together, and they meet the 10% of people who are least deferential to authority from Germany or from Belgium or from Norway, that society is going to be radically different than the previous society, right? Just like if you took a society that was the highest 10% of the population in terms of height, and they all moved together, that society is going to be a lot taller than the society that they came from. And I don't think that there's such a thing as, quote, a libertarian gene, but there are probably traits that are a basket of traits anyway that are being selected for, and then cultural traits that are being selected for. Plus, there's a whole bunch of specific variables regarding, the fact that no borders with other powerful states, the two oceans, the large geographic area, the fact that we have all these mountains and swamps and prairies, and it's just geographically a different thing, and the scope of state power, the degree of state control over the entire continent is just necessarily going to be physically limited relative to a place like the UK. The historical accident of when the United States became wealthy, when did its state become powerful? The timing is not the same. So you already had a wealthy, robust society before the state was essentially playing catch up until World War II, and I don't think that's necessarily the case in the UK. And the UK might have caught up by World War I, which is maybe not the case with the US. So that's a separate question, but I do think that Aristotle was right that you have to exercise good decision making. You have to make virtuous decisions. You have to be ethical in practice, not just in theory. It's not enough to read about this online. I remember one of the, I think he's still around, but people may know Anarcho-Pac, an anarcho-syndicalist, or at least he used to be. I have no idea if it's still true. I remember debating him in one of his videos. He was a big anarcho-syndicalist, and to his credit, intellectually honest and fair in his assessments, even if he was dead wrong. But I remember, he would say stuff about the bargaining power of employees relative to employers, and he would say stuff like ununionized workers have zero bargaining power with employers. None. They can't. The employer can dictate, not just the wages, but everything. And just as somebody who has had a job, I knew that was bullshit. Now, workers can't do the reverse. Workers can't dictate to their employers, this is how much I want to make, and this is how much I want to work, and these are the conditions that I want. I mean, you can make those claims, but it's there isn't this power imbalance that is so one-sided that one side can dictate to the other. There's this interplay, and usually somebody can get some. I mean, I was like, how many? I've gotten too many raises that I asked for or didn't ask for my bargaining power to be zero. And I've seen employers have to make concessions, general concessions, in order to attract labor that they didn't want to do, but they had to. And so I asked Anarcho-Pack, how many jobs have you actually had? Like, where did you learn? Where are you getting this idea that employers have no, or that the employers have 100% of the bargaining power? And he said, well, I read about it on left-wing blogs. And I said, have you ever had a job? He said, no, I'm a philosophy student. He lives at fucking home, right? So he never had a real job. He doesn't have that actual experience. And that's where the rubber kind of hits the roads, where his philosophy just falls to fucking pieces. And so even somebody that may have been slightly tangential, but and I maybe just wanted to get in a dig for Anarcho-Pack, but if you're not living that, if you're not making the choices yourself, then there's no point in being libertarian. Who cares? You don't want freedom, and freedom is scary too, right? Freedom is the opposite side of the responsibility coin. At the end of the day, you need to be responsible for yourself, and that's scary, right? That's why children don't want to grow up. You get to this point when you're a little child, you don't really think about it. You get a little bit older, and then you enjoy the fact that you have hobbies. Maybe you play t-ball, maybe you're into band, maybe you're into drama, and you just and your parents are just paying for everything, and some say they give you all your food and all your bedding, and like they're even giving you presents and blah blah blah, and that's great. And you don't want to have to pay the bills. You don't want to have to be responsible for figuring out where am I going to live and like how am I going to put food on the table, and can I just, wouldn't it be nicer if I could just do whatever I want and have whatever I need provided to me, no strings attached. And there's a reluctance, and I know because I felt it myself. As soon as I finished 8th grade, my parents started putting pressure on me to get a job. You need to get a job. You need to get a job. You need to get a job. They would even find jobs and come to me and be like, hey, the point was like 13, 14, 15, and I was like, no, I like being in my sense free in the sense that I can do what I want within scope. Of course, I never had money. I had no money to spend on my own. I couldn't do anything unless my parents agreed to do it, right? So if I wanted to go to a camp that cost $100 or $200, I needed them to okay that, and they were indulgent enough parents that they would do it. But and I resisted getting a job. But as soon as I did, and I got that first paycheck, I thought, oh, this is mine. Like I can decide how to spend this money. If I want to go eat out, I can do that. If I want to save it and get a better car, I can do that. Fundamentally changed my outlook, just like picking the gun, right? Holding the gun. I'm responsible, and I have now freedom that I did not have before. But if I had stayed in that cocoon of unfreedom, and it is unfreedom, you get all these socialists who are like, no, freedom is when you get all your needs taken care of, and then you can indulge yourself however you want. Two problems with that. Well, there's more than two problems with that. One, the systems that they try and build would not actually be able to provide the level of sustenance and resources that they want, right? It's not going to be good at providing food or housing or all those things or healthcare. But two, you're not actually free to do whatever you want. You're only free to do what the state or the commune decides is acceptable, or your parents, right? You're free to do whatever your parents allow you to do. That's not freedom, right? You're not actually, the scope of your decision making is limited by the discretion of the institution that is managing your life, which is not you, and that is not freedom. And also, incidentally, that is not going to be prosperous either. It's going to be in a post-industrial society that has somewhat of a market economy, that's going to be low growth, shoddy care, but you're not going to die. You're not going to starve. Now, if you get rid of the market economy, you're going to fucking starve. And there's going to be brutal, direct tyranny also. It's going to be suboptimal. There won't be any innovation. There'll be high depression. You won't feel any kind of sense of worth, or you won't have a purpose, right? People need a purpose. And if you are just, you get whatever you want, your purpose is not going to be finger painting. Right? This is something the Venus Project, oh, you'll get everything you need, and then you can find purpose from being a violin player or whatever, doing fucking art. Yeah, if you're not subjected to the market discipline of producing stuff that people want, then none of the status that you achieve, that you can't achieve any status, you can't have any success, you can't have any glory, you can't have any kind of triumph, right? You can't have any adversity to come over. That would be awful. That would be the end of having a reason to exist. It would be like just being on heroin all the time, even assuming that it worked in terms of material production, which these socialist utopias won't do. But even if we granted that, it would not actually give people what they need, and that's why I think the UK kind of sucks. And if you have a craving for something that's more vigorous, if you have a craving for having the scope and the freedom to do well. I remember Margaret Thatcher saying, Americans are smart because they're not ashamed to do well. And of course, there's plenty of Americans who are ashamed of that, and we have a tempest going on in the United States right now between competing forces. The courses of collectivistic socialism and envy and Marxism and identity politics, and then and not to make it too binary, I mean, it's more complicated than that. But then people are like, yeah, it is good to go out and get rich. It is good to go and be successful. It is good to be the best and to compete and blah blah blah. And the people in the UK or in Germany who felt that way, they moved here a long time ago. And the people who stayed behind were the most, as long as I can go to the pub, as long as I can watch my soccer team, as long as I can go to the NHS clinic, it doesn't matter if the care is not really that good, or even if they deny care arbitrarily, it's good enough for me. I feel happy not having to make those decisions for myself. Well, then you're surrendering the decision making to somebody else, and you become a serf. And being a serf means being poor. It means being unfree. It means having no purpose. It means having a horrible, terrible, boring life, even if it's one that's secure in terms of comfort. Well, it's not secure in terms of protection if you ever need it. And the freedom is dynamic and scary. And many people are terrified of it. And many people who have bad experiences reject it. Right, a lot of these social justice warriors are people who are fucking failures, who are losers, basically. Ugly, disgusting, dipshit, stuck trying to gain renown and success and status through universities, and they're bitter and awful and terrible. And sadly, that mentality, though, is the mentality that the government likes. The government likes people like that and encourages their existence and their creation. Right? That's what public schools are all about, if not in intention, at least in effect. So I would highly, and to go to just kind of speak to Poe personally here, because she's talked about maybe moving to the United States. Well, you should definitely visit the United States and see what you think. It's a big country. There's a lot to see. So visiting New York or Chicago is not going to be the same thing as going to, say, Arizona or Maine or Alaska, God forbid. There's an actual struggle here. If we could look at particular issues, gun control is victorious in the UK, and I don't see that changing. Even with these 3D printed guns, I just don't see anyone in the UK actually doing that, right? I think that they're too much subjects to do that. And we have people in the United States who are like this. I just watched a Vice video where a guy created a quote-unquote ghost gun. It wasn't a ghost gun because it was made out of metal, so it's not invisible, but he printed his own AR-15, which is perfectly legal. It's not a crime. And when he was done, after he did the segment, he turned it into the police. That's all he could think about doing was, I can't trust myself or anyone I know to have this. I don't want this power. I don't want this freedom. I don't want to have the option that if I need this, I have it, right? An AR-15 is a potentially useful thing for recreation, for hunting, for self-defense, for showing your friends at a party. Fuck, there's lots of reasons you could want it or do it. And all he could think about is, take this away, government. I don't want this. I'm not worthy. I'm not responsible. I'm a fucking slave. And so there's a lot of people in the United States who are like that. But there's a lot of other people in the United States who are not like that. And there's actually, their political power is like it's almost the same. So I highly encourage people who agree with me to move to the United States if possible. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me all know what you think, and I will talk to you all another time. Cheers.